What if the world you think you know is built on lies? Not just any lies, but deliberate deceptions crafted by the very people trusted to chart our planet mapmakers, who wielded their pens like weapons, bending geography to serve love, power, or sheer ambition. Picture a medieval cartographer hunched over parchment, ink staining his fingers as he carefully shifts coastlines, erases islands, or even invents entire kingdoms. These weren't mistakes, they were calculated acts of deception, and their consequences rippled across empires, shaping wars, marriages, and the fate of nations. This is the hidden history of cartographic duels, where maps became tools of seduction, weapons of war, and instruments of political sabotage. Think about the last map you saw, a classroom globe, a GPS screen, or even the faded pages of an old atlas. We take their accuracy for granted, but centuries ago, maps were more than guides, they were statements of power. A king might demand a map that exaggerated his territory to intimidate rivals. A love-struck noble could commission a chart that placed his beloved's homeland at the center of the world, a romantic gesture etched in ink and vellum. And sometimes, a mapmaker's own pride or vendetta would twist continents beyond recognition, leaving behind a trail of confusion that historians would puzzle over for generations. The most astonishing part, many of these lies went unchallenged for centuries, woven so skillfully into the fabric of geography that they became truth. So why did they do it? What drove these cartographers to risk their reputations, or even their lives, to distort the world? The answers are as tangled as the coastlines they redrew. Some sought royal favor, crafting flattering maps to win patronage. Others acted as spies, slipping false geography into enemy hands to mislead armies or merchants. And then there were those who lied for love, altering maps to impress a sweetheart or secure a marriage alliance. But beneath every deception lay a deeper truth. Maps are never just about land. They're about control, desire, and the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. Today, we're peeling back the layers of these beautiful, dangerous lies, uncovering the human drama behind the ink-stained parchment. By the end, you'll never look at a map the same way again. The roots of cartographic deception run deep, far deeper than most realize. Long before medieval mapmakers twisted coastlines for love or war, ancient civilizations were already manipulating geography to suit their needs. Take the Babylonian Imago Mundi, one of the oldest known world maps, carved into clay around 600 BC. It placed Babylon at the center of the universe, surrounded by distant, vaguely sketched lands meant to emphasize its supremacy. Even then, maps were less about accuracy and more about storytelling, a way to assert dominance, reinforce myths, or justify conquest. But the medieval period turned these tricks into high-stakes games of deception. Unlike today, when satellites and GPS leave little room for doubt, back then, a mapmaker's word was often the only authority on distant lands. If a cartographer claimed an island existed, or didn't, who could prove him wrong? This uncertainty gave rise to some of history's most brazen geographical lies. Take the legendary Phantom Island of High Brassel, which appeared on maps off the coast of Ireland for centuries. Sailors swore it existed, shrouded in mist, only to vanish when approached. Some say it was a navigational error, but others suspect it was deliberate, a ploy to lure explorers, or perhaps a romantic flourish to sell more maps. Then there were the political deceptions. In the 12th century, the Norman kings of Sicily commissioned maps that exaggerated their Mediterranean holdings, making their small but strategic kingdom appear vast and unconquerable. It worked. Rivals hesitated to attack, fearing an opponent far more powerful than reality. Meanwhile, Venetian merchants, masters of trade and intrigue, spread false maps that mislabeled ports or erased rival cities altogether, steering competitors toward dead ends while they monopolized lucrative routes. But perhaps the most fascinating lies were the romantic ones. In 1580, a Flemish cartographer named Gerardus Mercator, yes, the same man behind the famous Mercator projection, reportedly tweaked the borders of a noblewoman's homeland on a commissioned map, making her family's lands appear larger and more prosperous. Why? Because her suitor, a wealthy duke, wanted to impress her. It was cartographic courtship where love letters were written in ink and latitude. So why did these lies persist for so long? Without satellites or fact-checkers, maps were judged by their beauty and the reputation of their makers, not their accuracy. A well-drawn map, even if fictional, could become truth simply because people believed it. And in a world where perception shaped power, sometimes a lie on parchment was more valuable than the land itself. Of all the cartographic deceptions woven through history, few were as brazen or as strangely touching as the case of the lover's map. In the late 1300s, a minor nobleman from the Alpine region of Tyrol commissioned a map that would change his fate. His lands were modest, little more than a cluster of villages nestled between mountains, but his ambitions were anything but small. He'd fallen for a princess from a powerful dynasty, and he knew her family would never approve a match with a ruler of such meager stature. So he turned to the one tool that could bend perception, a map. The cartographer he hired was no ordinary draftsman. He was an artist of illusion, skilled in the subtle tricks of his trade. With careful strokes, he stretched the borders of the nobleman's territory, adding valleys that didn't exist, inflating the size of towns, and even sketching a phantom castle atop a fictional hill. Rivers were widened into trade routes, forests grew denser, and suddenly, what had been a backwater fiefdom appeared on parchment as a prosperous realm worthy of a princess. The map was a masterpiece of flattery, and it worked. The princess's father, impressed by the seemingly vast and resource-rich land, agreed to the marriage. But lies, like ink, eventually bleed. When the princess and her retinue arrived for the wedding, the truth was impossible to hide. Instead of the sprawling kingdom promised by the map, she found a handful of timber-framed houses and a single stone keep. The mighty river was a shallow stream, the impenetrable forests were scraggly thickets. The scandal erupted instantly. The princess's father demanded the marriage be annulled, the cartographer vanished, likely fleeing for his life, and the nobleman was left with nothing but humiliation and a very real war threat. Yet this wasn't just a tale of failed deception. It revealed something deeper about the psychology of maps and love. To the nobleman, the lie wasn't just about land, it was about hope. He'd gambled that reality could be rewritten, that desire might reshape the world, and in a way, he wasn't entirely wrong. Though his scheme collapsed, the incident exposed how easily power and love could distort truth. Other suitors took note. Soon, exaggerated maps became an open secret in royal courts, with diplomats whispering about which territories had been enhanced for marriage proposals. Was it reckless? Absolutely. But was it also, in its own twisted way, romantic? Consider the audacity of it. A man who loved so fiercely, he redrew the earth itself to reach her. Of course, the princess might disagree. If love could bend maps, then war could break them entirely. While some cartographers twisted coastlines for romance, others wielded their pens like swords, slicing through rival kingdoms with deliberate strokes of ink. Political cartography wasn't just about navigation, it was psychological warfare, where a well-placed lie could destabilize empires. Take the infamous Vanishing Kingdom scandal of 1423, when the Duchy of Burgundy paid a team of mapmakers to systematically erase their rival, the County of Savoy, from every major atlas in Europe. Towns vanished, borders shrank. By the time Savoy's diplomats realized what had happened, half the continent's merchants were refusing to trade with what they believed was a failing state until Savoy's ruler marched into a royal summit and unfurled a stolen Burgundian map, its fraudulent alterations still visible under candlelight. But the boldest manipulations weren't just erasures, they were inventions. In the early 1500s, King Christian of Denmark ordered his cartographers to extend his kingdom's coastline westward, adding miles of fictional fjords and harbors to ancient charts. Why? To justify invading a neighboring duchy by claiming it had once been Danish land. The maps, aged artificially with tea stains and smoke, were discovered in a monastery archive and promptly used as evidence in a papal court. By the time scholars debunked them, Danish troops had already annexed the territory. The lesson was clear: a map could rewrite history faster than any army. Yet the most devastating lies weren't always grand territorial claims. Sometimes the smallest tweaks sparked the biggest conflicts. In 1612, a single mislabeled river on a Spanish map triggered a bloody border dispute between two Italian city-states. The cartographer, later revealed to be in the pay of a third party, had shifted the river's course by barely a thumb's width on parchment, but on the ground that thumb represented miles of fertile farmland. By the time the fraud was exposed, thousands had died in skirmishes over land that, according to older maps, neither side had ever rightfully owned. So how did societies fight back against cartographic sabotage? Some rulers employed counter-cartographers, experts tasked with detecting forgeries by analyzing ink, parchment, and even the handwriting of rival mapmakers. Others turned to public spectacle. The Holy Roman Emperor once displayed a fraudulent map in the town square, then burned it before a crowd as a warning. But the damage was often irreversible. A lie on a map once believed became a lie in the history books and in the minds of those who acted on it, perhaps the cruelest irony. Many of these fraudulent maps still shape our world today. Modern borders in parts of Africa and Asia trace back to colonial-era maps drawn with deliberate errors, their lines scribbled by officials who'd never set foot on the land. Rivers were misplaced, tribal territories ignored, and entire ethnic groups divided by borders that existed only on paper. Until they didn't, the pen, it turns out, wasn't just mightier than the sword. It was the sword. The most dangerous lies weren't just lines on parchment, they were entire islands pulled from thin air. For centuries, cartographers sprinkled phantom islands across their maps like traps, knowing rivals would chase these fictions to the edge of the world. One of the most infamous, the so-called Island of Gold, first appeared on a Portuguese chart in the 1500s, a glittering speck in the Atlantic promising untold riches. Sailors whispered of beaches strewn with nuggets, of rivers running with gold dust. Expeditions launched one after another, each vanishing into the same empty stretch of ocean. The truth, the island never existed. It was a cartographic honeypot designed to drain the resources of rival nations by sending their ships on feudal quests. But why did these myths hold such power? In an age when maps were rare and expensive, their creators wielded near mystical authority. If a respected cartographer drew an island, who dared say it wasn't there? And the lie grew bolder with each copy. Mapmakers, unwilling to admit gaps in their knowledge, would replicate phantom islands from older charts rather than risk omitting something real. The Island of Gold migrated from atlas to atlas for over 200 years, its legend growing even as survivors returned empty-handed. Some blamed storms or bad luck, others accused rivals of stealing the treasure first. The truth that they'd been chasing ink was too humiliating to accept. The consequences were deadly. In 1721, a British fleet wasted 6 months searching for the Isle of Demons, a fictional landmass off Newfoundland said to be haunted by shrieking spirits. The crew, driven to madness by scurvy and storms, finally realized the island was a fabrication, but not before losing half their men. Even famous explorers weren't immune. Christopher Columbus carried maps showing the non-existent island of Antalya, a detail that may have fueled his insistence that he'd reached Asia. What's chilling is how long these lies endured. As late as 1912, a German naval vessel spent weeks crisscrossing the South Pacific searching for Doherty Island, a landmass that had appeared on maps since the 1600s. They found nothing but open water. Modern satellite imaging finally erased these ghosts, yet their legacy lingers. The International Hydrographic Organization only removed the last phantom islands from official charts in the 1990s, proof that a lie, once etched into geography, can outlive empires. The cruelest twist, some phantom islands may have been honest mistakes, misplaced reefs, optical illusions, or even icebergs mistaken for land, but others were undeniably malicious. Venetian traders, for instance, planted false islands near rival Geno's trade routes, hoping to shipwreck competitors. The practice became so common that savvy captains learned to cross-reference multiple maps, treating each as a palimpsest of lies and half-truths. In the end, these deceptions reveal a darker truth. Maps were never just guides, they were chessboards, and every island, real or imagined, was a move in someone's game. Faith didn't just inspire maps, it commandeered them. In the medieval world, where heaven and earth were thought to intertwine, cartographers didn't merely chart coastlines, they drew divine order onto parchment. Jerusalem, believed to be the spiritual center of creation, dominated these sacred maps, often inflated in size and placed precisely at their heart. The famous Hereford Mappa Mundi, crafted around 1300, isn't a navigational tool, it's a sermon in ink. Paradise appears at the top, monstrous races lurk at the edges, and every river, mountain, and city bends to fit a cosmic hierarchy where faith dictated geography. But the most tantalizing lies weren't the obvious ones. Clerics and scholars filled blank spaces with lands ripped from scripture, like the Garden of Eden, meticulously plotted near the Tigris and Euphrates, or the mythical kingdom of Prester John, a Christian utopia said to glitter somewhere in the east. These weren't harmless fables. When Pope Urban Roman II called for the First Crusade in 1095, he wielded maps showing Jerusalem not just as a city, but as the rightful property of Christendom, its exaggerated holiness justifying bloodshed. Centuries later, explorers like Vasco da Gama would carry similar maps, searching for Prester John's realm as they carved paths to colonization. The tension between faith and facts reached a boiling point in the 16th century. When Flemish cartographer Gerardus Mercator dared to prioritize accurate navigation over theology, depicting a spherical earth where Jerusalem wasn't central, the backlash was swift. Clerics accused him of heresy, and rival mapmakers rushed to produce corrected versions restoring the Holy City to its rightful place. Even the Vatican commissioned its own atlases, with continents subtly reshaped to align with biblical timelines. The message was clear: maps weren't just records of the world, they were weapons in a war over truth. Yet the bitterest irony, these sacred deceptions often backfired. When Spanish missionaries arrived in the Americas, they carried maps marking vast regions as terra infidelis, land awaiting conversion. Indigenous territories were erased or labeled as empty, justifying displacement and cultural erasure. But the same maps studied by Enlightenment scholars became evidence of the Church's manipulations. By the 1800s, as science peeled back layers of dogma, the once unquestionable authority of religious cartography crumbled. What survived, though, was the lesson: every map is a mirror. Medieval clerics saw a world ordered by God. Today, we might see one shaped by data, but the power to redraw reality. That hasn't changed at all. Even the most respected names in cartography weren't immune to bending the truth, sometimes with consequences that outlasted empires. Take Gerardus Mercator, the 16th century mapmaker whose name still graces classrooms worldwide. His famous projection, designed to help sailors navigate straight lines across oceans, came with a hidden cost. It stretched lands near the poles, making Europe appear grotesquely large while shrinking continents like Africa and South America. Greenland, in reality 1/8 the size of Africa, ballooned to near equivalence on his maps. Was this an innocent side effect of math, or something more insidious? The answer lies in the world Mercator inhabited. Europe's colonial powers were carving up the globe, and maps weren't just tools, they were propaganda. A vast, dominant Europe visually justified its so-called civilizing mission over smaller lands. Mercator himself worked closely with traders and explorers, crafting maps for patrons who profited from conquest. Coincidence, perhaps, but when his contemporary, the Flemish cartographer Abraham Ortelius, proposed a more balanced projection, it was Mercator's version that stuck. The choice wasn't about accuracy, it was about power. The ripple effects were staggering. For centuries, schoolchildren memorized maps where Scandinavia dwarfed India, where Britain loomed over entire African kingdoms. This warped perspective seeped into politics, education, even pop culture, reinforcing the myth of European superiority long after colonialism's end. Critics argue Mercator couldn't have foreseen this. His goal was navigational precision, not propaganda. Yet the timing is suspicious. His projection gained traction just as Europe's empires reached their zenith, its distortions mirroring the era's racial hierarchies. Modern cartographers have tried to correct the record. The Peters projection, developed in the 1970s, showed continents at their true proportions, revealing how Mercator's map had minimized the global south. But old habits die hard. Many institutions still cling to the Mercator version, proving how deeply bias embeds itself in what we call fact. The real lesson here isn't about one man's intent, it's about how even the driest science can carry the fingerprints of its era's prejudices. Maps don't just show the world, they shape how we think about it, and sometimes the most dangerous lies are the ones we don't realize we're believing. Pirates didn't just plunder ships, they plundered truth itself. In the golden age of piracy, a map was more valuable than gold, and the cleverest buccaneers knew how to weaponize them. Take the infamous Captain Henry Mainwaring, a 17th century privateer turned pirate who orchestrated one of history's most audacious cartographic cons. After seizing a fortune in Spanish silver, he needed to throw pursuers off his trail. His solution: he commissioned a beautifully detailed map of a fictitious island, complete with winding paths and a bold X marking a non-existent treasure hoard. Then he accidentally let the map fall into the hands of a rival captain. The ruse worked flawlessly. For months, British and Spanish ships combed the wrong stretch of the Caribbean, while Mainwaring's crew slipped away to fence their real loot in secret ports. But pirates didn't just forge maps to mislead, they used them to frame enemies too. The notorious Bartholomew Roberts, known as Black Bart, once planted a falsified chart in the cabin of a competing pirate ship, showing a lucrative merchant convoy route. When authorities captured the vessel and found the map, they assumed the rival crew was planning an attack. The unlucky pirates were hanged while Roberts swooped in to claim their territory. It was a masterclass in cartographic sabotage, proving that in the pirate world, ink could be deadlier than cutlasses. The darkest trick of all, though, was the Ghost Port, a phantom harbor drawn on maps to lure unsuspecting ships into ambush. Pirates like Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, would scatter these lies among trading posts, knowing merchants would seek shelter in what appeared to be safe anchorages. Instead, they'd find jagged reefs or worse, a line of cannons waiting in the fog. The tactic was so effective that legitimate mapmakers began adding disclaimers to their charts, warning sailors of reputed ports not yet verified. What made these deceptions so terrifying was their longevity. Unlike royal cartographers who answered to kings, pirates had no reputation to uphold. A lie could spread unchecked, passed from ship to ship until it became accepted truth. Some pirate-forged maps even found their way into official archives, where they misled historians for centuries. In 2008, marine archaeologists searching for a lost pirate stronghold, described on a 17th century map, found nothing but open water, just as its creator, the pirate Olivier Levasseur, had intended. The ultimate irony, many of these lies were born of desperation. For every pirate living in luxury, dozens were one step ahead of the hangman's noose. A faked map might buy time to negotiate a pardon or distract a navy long enough to escape. In the end, pirate cartography wasn't just about greed. It was about outsmarting a world that wanted them dead, one clever lie at a time. The most brilliant spies never carried weapons, they carried compasses. In the shadowy world of Renaissance espionage, mapmakers held a unique advantage. Their work was considered too technical to be suspicious, yet too valuable to ignore. A well-drafted chart could pass through enemy hands unchallenged, its decorative flourishes hiding coded messages in plain sight. Take the case of Giovanni Battista Agnese, a 16th century Venetian cartographer whose exquisite atlases graced the courts of Europe. Few knew he was also a master of deception, embedding naval troop strengths in the ornate compass roses adorning his maps. A fleur de lis pointing northeast might indicate French ships massing near Genoa, while an unusually bold latitude line could mark the weak point in a rival's coastal defenses. But the true artistry lay in the negative space what mapmakers chose to omit. In 1588, as the Spanish Armada prepared to invade England, Queen Elizabeth's spies circulated deliberately flawed maps among Spanish agents, showing the English Channel wider and calmer than reality. The deception proved catastrophic. Spanish galleons, expecting ample maneuvering room, found themselves funneled into tight, treacherous waters where England's smaller ships picked them apart. The mistakes were later blamed on an overworked Flemish cartographer, but documents reveal the man was actually one of Elizabeth's most trusted operatives, paid handsomely to distort key navigational details. Some spies took the craft even further. Austrian agent Franz Xaver von Zach didn't just alter maps, he invented an entire surveying technique to mask his espionage. Traveling through Ottoman territory in the 1700s under the guise of mapping stars, he used celestial observations to secretly chart military fortifications. His astronomical calculations were actually precise measurements of hill gradients and cannon placements, disguised as harmless academic notes. The Ottomans, flattered by his interest in their culture, never suspected the man patiently sketching constellations was drafting invasion routes for the Habsburg army. The riskiest gambits involved not just stealing secrets, but planting them. During the War of the Austrian Succession, Prussian spies infiltrated French cartographic workshops and subtly altered the border regions of newly printed maps. Streams were rerouted to suggest natural boundaries where none existed, while forests were enlarged to imply impassable terrain. When French commanders planned their campaigns using these maps, they they unknowingly funneled troops into Prussian ambushes. By the time the fraud was discovered, thousands had died following imaginary geography. What makes these cartographic spies so fascinating is their dual legacy. Many of their false maps still survive in museums, celebrated as masterpieces of art and science. The very deceptions that once swayed wars now hang framed in libraries, their secrets faded into harmless history. Yet their methods live on. Modern intelligence agencies still train operatives in geographic deception, proving that even in our satellite-mapped world, the oldest trick in the spy's handbook remains unchanged. If you want to hide the truth, sometimes you need to draw it yourself. History remembers the bold explorers who pushed the edges of the known world, but not all their discoveries were honest. Some of the most celebrated breakthroughs were carefully staged lies, with maps serving as the ultimate props in a high-stakes game of reputation and riches. Consider the case of the Portuguese navigator Diogo Cao, who returned to Lisbon in 1485 with maps claiming he'd sailed hundreds of miles farther down Africa's west coast than any European before him. The charts showed dramatic new capes and rivers, earning him royal accolades and funding for future voyages. There was just one problem: much of it was fabricated. Later expeditions revealed Cao had copied sections from older Arab charts, blending real and imagined geography to exaggerate his achievements. Why risk such a deception? The answer lies in the cutthroat competition of the age of exploration. Monarchs rewarded explorers not for truth, but for headlines. The more territory claimed, the richer the patronage. A navigator like Cao knew that returning empty-handed meant obscurity, while a discovery, no matter how dubious, could secure ships, crews, and immortality in the history books. The consequences rippled far beyond court politics. Indigenous African kingdoms suddenly found their ancestral lands labeled as new on European maps, their sovereignty erased with a stroke of ink. When the Congo ruler Nzinga Nku, who saw Portuguese maps depicting his centuries-old kingdom as recently discovered, he reportedly asked envoys, "Do your cartographers think the world began when they first drew it?" The most damaging lies weren't just about land, they rewrote history itself. In 1520, Spanish conquistador Alonso Álvarez de Pineda produced a map of the Gulf Coast that conveniently omitted thriving Maya and Aztec cities, portraying the region as sparsely populated wilderness. This fiction helped justify colonial land grabs under the legal doctrine of terra nullius, the idea that empty territories were free for the taking. The same trick reappeared centuries later in Australia and North America, where indigenous territories were systematically left off official maps to legitimize displacement. Perhaps the cruelest irony, many of these forged discoveries became permanent features on the map. The Strait of Anion, an entirely fictional waterway supposedly connecting the Atlantic and Pacific north of California, appeared on charts for over 200 years, luring countless ships to icy deaths in the Arctic. Even after its non-existence was proven, the myth persisted because admitting the lie would have meant admitting the limits of European knowledge. Today, these cartographic deceptions force uncomfortable questions. When we celebrate explorers like Cao or Pineda, are we honoring courage or complicity in a system that traded truth for power? Modern archaeologists have a term for this: discovery bias, the tendency to credit outsiders with finding places long known to local populations. It's a reminder that maps were never neutral. They were, and still are, tools of storytelling, and whoever holds the pen gets to decide whose story counts. Love wasn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes it hid in the margins. While kings and conquerors used maps to wage wars, quieter souls turned them into canvases for devotion, stitching secret messages into coastlines and forests. Take the case of the Heart of Bohemia, a map commissioned by a lovelorn nobleman in 1542. At first glance, it showed his lands with typical precision until you noticed the rivers. They curled deliberately into the shape of a heart, framing his beloved's family estate at its center. The cartographer, paid handsomely for his discretion, had turned geography into a love letter only one person could read. Then there were the initials. In the rugged Alps, a 16th-century mapmaker named Matthias Bergauer carved his sweetheart's name into the landscape literally. Where most charts labeled peaks with local names, his magnum opus featured a cluster of mountains whose first letters, when read north to south, spelled ANNA. The ruse was risky. His patron, a duke with a notorious temper, might have punished such frivolity, but Anna noticed. She recognized her name woven into the wilderness, and 2 years later, they married beneath a canopy painted with that very map. But perhaps the most daring romantic deception came from an anonymous artisan in the court of Francis Louis XIII. Tasked with illustrating a royal atlas, he hid a marriage proposal in the borders of a map of Provence. To the untrained eye, the decorative vines were mere flourishes, but his beloved, a lady-in-waiting fluent in botany, saw the truth. Each flower's placement followed the language of herbs, where rosemary meant remembrance and ivy signaled fidelity. The final touch, a tiny compass rose pointing not north but toward the chapel where he'd wait for her answer. These weren't just pretty lies, they were acts of rebellion. In an era where marriages were transactions and love rarely factored into alliances, mapmakers became unlikely champions of the heart. A noblewoman in Madrid, forced into a betrothal with a man she despised, once received a smuggled map from her true love, a junior diplomat. On it, the road to her family's summer estate was labeled the Path of Sorrows, while a nearby hamlet bore the alias Hope. She never made it to the altar. Historians believe she followed that map straight into his arms, leaving behind a note that read, "Geography does not lie." What makes these cartographic love stories so poignant is their fragility. Unlike the grand political deceptions that shaped empires, these small, tender lies were never meant to last, faded by time, painted over by later revisions, or simply lost to history. Most vanished without a trace. But the few that survive remind us that maps, for all their power to deceive, could also whisper truths too dangerous to speak aloud. In the end, the boldest lie a map could tell wasn't about land or gold. It was about the human heart's unshakable belief that love, like a well-drawn compass, would always point true. In Renaissance Venice, where canals whispered secrets and merchants traded lies as readily as silk, two mapmakers turned parchment into a battlefield. Pietro Bertelli and Giacomo Gastaldi should have been colleagues, both masters of their craft, both suppliers to the Doge's glittering court. But in a city built on rivalry, their competition curdled into something darker, a duel fought not with steel but with ink and cunning. Bertelli struck first. Hearing Gastaldi had secured a commission to map the Republic's new territories in Dalmatia, he secretly paid a scribe to leak an older map, one that conveniently shrank those same lands to insignificance. The parchment, artfully aged with candle smoke, claimed to be based on lost Roman surveys. Venetian senators, proud of their expanding empire, were furious. Gastaldi's contract hung by a thread until he retaliated with a forgery of his own. His masterpiece was a rediscovered chart of the Adriatic, attributed to a mythical Arab geographer. It showed Bertelli's family vineyards a source of immense pride as a malarial swamp. The insult was exquisitely crafted. The map's calligraphy matched known Islamic styles, and Gastaldi even bribed a spice trader to authenticate it as a rare relic. For months, the two men traded increasingly outrageous fabrications. Bertelli, found a scroll proving Venice's rival Genoa had discovered the New World first, Gastaldi circulated a map depicting Bertelli's hometown as the site of Sodom. The feud reached its climax over a single sheet of vellum. Gastaldi unveiled what he claimed was a 2nd century Roman map of the Mediterranean, its edges brittle with age. The detail was breathtaking, every cove, every island labeled in flawless Latin. But Bertelli, sniffing the parchment, noticed something odd. The ancient stains smelled of bergamot. Tea, a luxury only recently imported from the East, couldn't have touched Roman hands. With a flourish, he dropped the map into a bowl of hot water. Brown tendrils curled into the liquid proof of Gastaldi's modern tampering. The scandal should have ended careers, yet in Venice, where deception was an art form, the duel only heightened their fame. The Doge, amused by their audacity, commissioned them to collaborate on an official atlas, with spies monitoring their inkwells. The resulting maps, forged in mutual distrust, became some of the era's most accurate, a testament to how rivalry, even poisoned by lies, could sharpen the search for truth. Some lies don't just bend history, they rewrite it entirely. In 1558, a Venetian nobleman named Niccolò Zeno published a map that sent shockwaves through Europe. It showed the North Atlantic with impossible precision, including detailed coastlines of Greenland and even parts of North America, all allegedly charted by his ancestors 2 centuries before Columbus. The so-called Zeno map wasn't just a curiosity, it was a bomb thrown into the heart of history. If genuine, it meant a humble Venetian family had beaten Europe's greatest explorers to the New World by generations. The map was a masterpiece of deception. Niccolò claimed he'd discovered it in a dusty family archive, a relic from the voyages of his ancestors, the Zeno brothers. According to his accompanying narrative, these intrepid sailors had ventured west in the 1300s, encountering lands teeming with strange peoples and exotic wildlife. The story was irresistible, a forgotten chapter of exploration that flattered Venetian pride while undermining Spain's claims to the Americas. Scholars pored over the map's intricate details, the jagged fjords of Friesland, an island that didn't exist, the oddly familiar contours of Newfoundland labeled as Estatiland, a name found nowhere else in medieval records. For centuries, the lie held power because it fed a hunger older than maps themselves, the desire to be first. National rivalries in Renaissance Europe weren't just about territory, they were about legacy. Spain had Columbus, Portugal had Vasco da Gama. Now, Venice could boast the Zenos. Even skeptics hesitated to debunk the map outright, fearing backlash from a republic eager for heroes. The Zeno family, meanwhile, reaped the rewards, elevated status, political favors, and a permanent place in the mythos of exploration. The cracks began with the whales. Niccolò's account described his ancestors encountering creatures as large as islands off the coast of Greenland, a dramatic detail lifted straight from popular medieval bestiaries. Then came the clincher. Modern analysis of the parchment and ink revealed techniques unknown before the 1500s, the final nail in the coffin. The map's suspiciously accurate longitude markings, something no sailor could have calculated in the 1400s. Yet the real scandal wasn't the forgery, it was why so many wanted to believe it. The Zeno map thrived in a world desperate for alternative narratives, where every nation craved a Columbus of its own. In the 1930s, fascist Italy even resurrected the myth, using it to glorify supposed Italian supremacy in exploration. That's the danger of cartographic lies. They don't just mislead, they give us the past we wish we'd had, reshaping history to fit the stories we tell about ourselves. Today, the Zeno map sits in a Copenhagen museum, labeled as a curiosity rather than a revelation. But its legacy lingers in the way we still fight over who discovered what, as if land can belong to whoever draws it first. The Xenos understood a truth both beautiful and terrifying. Maps aren't just records, they're arguments, and sometimes the most persuasive arguments are the ones that never happened. History often paints cartographic deception as a battlefield of kings and conquerors, but quieter revolutions unfolded in the margins, led by women who wielded quills like scalpels. Take the Countess of Montbéliard, a 16-year-old widow in 1421 who inherited her late husband's lands and his debts. When creditors demanded maps to assess her holdings, she commissioned a new survey that accidentally omitted the most fertile valleys, leaving them blank as if they'd never existed. The ruse bought her time to secretly sell those lands to a sympathetic ally, funneling the funds into legal battles that ultimately freed her from her husband's financial ruin. To the creditors, it was a clerical error. To her, it was survival. Then there was Sister Clara of Salzburg, a Benedictine nun whose convent's vineyards had been gradually encroached upon by local nobility. The bishop's maps, drawn by male scribes, showed the boundaries creeping inward with each revision until Clara, trained in geometry by her father, clandestine redrew the borders based on ancient charters hidden in the abbey's archives. She smuggled her corrections to a printer in Augsburg, who reproduced them under a false name. When the bishop received his updated atlas, he never noticed the subtle shift that restored 12 acres to the sisters. Clara's rebellion wasn't just about land. It was about proving that sacred geography could be as malleable as the politics that distorted it. But perhaps the most audacious act came from a nameless mapmaker in 17th century Kyoto. A merchant's daughter forbidden from inheriting the family business, she spent years apprenticing under a blind cartographer, learning to etch coastlines with such precision that her work went unquestioned. When her father died, her brother's maps showed their shipping routes bypassing lucrative ports until she produced her own, revealing hidden currents that cut travel time in half. The guild dismissed her claims until sailors returned confirming her charts were right. By then, she'd already used her earnings to buy a seat at the mapmaker's table, the first woman in Japan to do so. These women's stories share a common thread. Their deceptions weren't about ego or empire, but agency. In eras when wills could be overturned, convents starved into submission, and daughters disinherited with a stroke of a magistrate's pen, a well-placed lie on parchment became armor. Modern archivists still debate whether to correct these fraudulent maps or preserve them as they are flawed testaments to ingenuity. After all, if history is written by the victors, these women remind us that sometimes the only way to win is to redraw the lines yourself. Among all the phantom lands that haunted early maps, none burned brighter or more deceitfully than Nuremberg. European cartographers in the 1500s sketched this mythical city along the northeastern coast of North America, depicting towers taller than Rome's, streets paved with gold, and a river so wide it could swallow the Thames whole. The name itself sounded like music to ambitious explorers. Nuremberg, a place whispered in taverns and royal courts alike, where fortunes waited to be plucked like ripe fruit. But like so many cartographic fantasies, its origins were equal parts accident and opportunism. The legend likely began with a mistranslation. Algonquian tribes spoke of a place called Nolembeka, meaning quiet stretch of water, a simple description of a calm river bend. But European ears, conditioned by tales of El Dorado and the 7 cities of gold, twisted the word into something grander. By the time it reached mapmakers, Nolembeka had morphed into Nuremberg, a kingdom dripping with wealth. The exaggeration wasn't entirely innocent. French explorer Jean-Alphonse, who claimed to have visited the city in 1542, described walls encrusted with gems and a ruler who dined on golden platters. His account, later proven fabricated, was no naive mistake. It was a calculated bid for funding from a king obsessed with New World riches. What followed was a frenzy of credulity. Maps throughout the late 16th century competed to outdo each other in depicting Norumbeg's splendor. One Venetian chart showed a labyrinth of canals rivaling Venice itself. An English map labeled it the London of the Wilderness, while German cartographers drew turreted castles that owed more to fairy tales than geography. The myth grew so persistent that even practical-minded settlers carried copies of these maps as they boarded ships for the New World, convinced they'd find a ready-made metropolis waiting. Reality, of course, was far harsher. When Samuel de Champlain sailed up the Penobscot River in 1604, searching for Norumbeg's fabled spires, he found only dense forests and bewildered indigenous hunters. His journal dripped with disappointment. No city, no gold, no trace of anything but the lies of men who drew what they wished to see. Yet the legend refused to die. Colonists, unwilling to admit they'd been duped, insisted Norumbega must lie just beyond the next river, the next mountain range. Some even argued the city had been lost to time, its ruins waiting to be rediscovered. The cruelest twist, Norumbega's ghost lingered longest not on maps but in law. In 1622, the Plymouth Council for New England granted land patents referencing the province of Norumbega, as if the fiction had solidified into fact. For decades, speculators bought and sold deeds to imaginary streets and squares, their parchment claims as flimsy as the maps that inspired them. It wasn't until the 1800s that the name finally faded from official use, though even today, whispers of Norumbega persist in Maine's backcountry, where locals still debate which bend in the Penobscot might have birthed the myth. Norumbega's legacy isn't just about a fake city. It's about the seductive power of belief, how the human mind, armed with a quill and a blank parchment, can conjure entire worlds from a single misunderstood word. In the end, the most enduring fantasy wasn't the gold or the towers. It was the unshakable faith that somewhere beyond the edge of the known, a place could exist exactly as we dreamed it. The Vatican's map room was no ordinary archive, it was a sanctum of sacred deception. Behind its gilded doors, a select brotherhood of clerics and cartographers worked in hushed secrecy, redrawing the world to fit the Church's vision of divine order. Their task wasn't just to record geography, but to shape it. When pilgrims complained that a holy mountain stood too far from the road to Jerusalem, these men didn't shrug. They picked up their pens. One surviving account describes a bishop in 1487 ordering a map that adjusted the peak's position by nearly 12 miles, placing it squarely on the route where weary travelers would see it and open their purses. But sacred cartography wasn't just about convenience, it was about control. Heretical lands vanished from official maps, their names scraped from parchment as if they'd never existed. The Waldensians, a persecuted Christian sect in the Alps, found their villages erased from diocesan charts, making it easier for inquisitors to claim the land was uninhabited when they seized it. Meanwhile, Jerusalem ballooned to 3 times its true size on pilgrimage maps, while Mecca shrank to a dot. The message was clear: the Church didn't just map the world, it defined what mattered. The most audacious frauds targeted rival faiths. In 1532, a team working under Pope Clement VII produced a recovered map attributed to Constantine the Great, showing the Holy Land with Christian sites predating Jewish and Islamic ones. The forgery was exquisite parchment aged with vinegar, ink mixed with period-appropriate iron gall. When Ottoman scholars exposed it, the Vatican quietly blamed an overzealous monk, but the damage was done. For decades, European diplomats cited the map to justify claims over Jerusalem, its lies hardening into political fact. What made these holy deceptions so potent was their veneer of infallibility. Unlike pirates or princes, the Church spoke with the authority of God Himself. A merchant might doubt a royal map, but who would question a chart bearing the papal seal? This unshakable trust let the Vatican's cartographers craft alternate realities with impunity. When Portuguese explorers brought back reports of Buddhist kingdoms in Asia, the maps sent to Rome replaced their temples with crosses, proving these were lost Christian communities awaiting reunion with the West. Yet the bitterest irony lay in the map's afterlife. Many survived not as curiosities, but as relics framed in cathedrals, kissed by pilgrims, their falsehoods sanctified by time. Today, scholars peel back their layers with X-rays and spectral imaging, revealing buried towns and altered coastlines. But in their heyday, these maps didn't just depict the world. For millions, they were the world, and that, perhaps, was the greatest miracle of all. Not moving mountains, but convincing everyone they'd been there all along. The Silk Road wasn't just a highway of goods, it was a labyrinth of lies, where every map held secrets and every route was a potential trap. Take the case of Samarkand's infamous Honey Road, a path that appeared on merchant maps as a swift, safe passage through the Pamir Mountains. What the maps didn't show, the honey referred not to sweetness, but to the swarms of bees that guarded a narrow valley, their hives strategically placed by local traders to deter rivals. Caravans lured by the promise of an easy journey found themselves swarmed, their camels bolting and precious cargo abandoned, until the same merchants who'd drawn the maps arrived to rescue the goods for a hefty fee. But the most brazen deceptions came from the oasis towns themselves. In the bustling markets of Kashgar, mapmakers sold charts that inflated the size of certain watering holes or erased others entirely. A tiny spring might blossom into a great oasis on parchment, while a rival town's reliable wells vanished into blank space. The goal wasn't just profit, it was survival. With a right map, a minor trading post could become the linchpin of the Silk Road, forcing caravans to detour through its gates and pay tolls, taxes, and bribes. One surviving ledger from Dunhuang reveals how a local governor paid a cartographer in silver to add 3 non-existent caravanserais to his territory, transforming a barren stretch into a must-stop hub. The lie worked so well that within a decade, real inns sprang up to meet the demand, turning fiction into fact. Then there were the phantom shortcuts paths that promised to shave weeks off a journey, but led only to dead ends or bandit ambushes. Persian guide Ahmed ibn Farah became legendary for his Eagle's Path map, which claimed to reveal a secret mountain pass near Bukhara. Dozens of rival caravans followed its twists into a box canyon, where Ahmed's allies waited to demand exorbitant rescue fees. By the time the ruse was exposed, he'd retired to a villa in Baghdad, his monopoly on the silk trade secure. Yet the greatest irony of these cartographic cons. Many were collaborative. Caravan masters knew their maps were flawed but used them anyway, understanding that shared deception kept the Silk Road's economy alive. If every trader knew the true best routes, competition would bankrupt the oasis towns that fed and sheltered them. Sometimes a lie wasn't just cunning, it was the glue that held the whole fragile system together. The next time you see an ancient Silk Road map, remember, its stains aren't just aged ink. They're the fingerprints of 1,000 whispered deals where truth was the one luxury no one could afford. The night sky has always been a canvas for human imagination, but few deceptions shine as brightly as the so-called moon hoax maps of the Middle Ages. At a time when telescopes were crude and lunar details blurred into mystery, astronomers filled the gaps with fantasies so convincing they passed as science for generations. One particularly notorious chart, drawn by a Bavarian monk in 1492, depicted vast seas of wine-dark liquid and spired cities clustered along the terminator line, the border between lunar day and night. The monk claimed these features were visible during certain celestial alignments, his careful shading and Latin annotations lending an air of scholarly authority. What made the lie so potent wasn't its artistry, but its timing. Europe was drunk on exploration, fresh from Columbus's voyage, and the idea that the moon might harbor its own civilizations felt less like fantasy and more like inevitable discovery. The ruse deepened when the map fell into the hands of an Italian printer who added sensational captions describing lunar inhabitants who harvested glowing crops under domed gardens. Copies spread across universities where professors debated whether the moon's cities were divine creations or proof of Aristotle's plural worlds. The hoax thrived because it fed a deeper hunger, the longing for the cosmos to be as rich and strange as Earth itself. Even skeptics hesitated to dismiss it entirely. After all, if the New World had shattered old assumptions, why couldn't the moon? But the truth, like the lunar surface itself, was far more barren. When Galileo trained his improved telescope on the moon in 1610, he saw no domes or canals, just craters and jagged highlands, yet the old maps didn't vanish. Some scholars clung to them, arguing Galileo's lens was flawed or that the cities had retreated to the far side. The map's creator, by then long dead, had unwittingly exposed a universal truth: humans don't just explore the unknown. We colonize it with our dreams, stamping familiar shapes onto the blank slate of the cosmos. What's haunting is how these lunar myths mirrored Earth's own cartographic deceptions. Just as Norimberga's golden towers grew from a misheard word, the moon's seas sprang from a simple optical illusion, the dark basalt plains that, to the naked eye, resembled oceans. And like phantom islands that lured sailors to their doom, these celestial lies had consequences. A Polish nobleman reportedly mortgaged his estate to fund a lunar expedition after seeing the map, while a Spanish mystic claimed to have received visions from the moon's bishopric. The final irony: some of these fictions still linger in our language. We call the moon's plains Maria, Latin for seas, because those medieval mapmakers believed they were water. Their lies became so woven into science that we forgot they were ever lies at all. That's the power of a well-drawn map. It doesn't just show the world as it is. It shows the world as we need it to be, even if that means planting cities in the stars. The tiny island of Zanon barely warranted a dot on most maps, just another rocky speck in the Tyrrhenian Sea between Rome and Naples. But in 1482, that dot became a powder keg. The trouble began when a Neapolitan cartographer named Enzo di Mariano received a lucrative commission from his king: redraw the kingdom's maritime borders to strengthen claims against papal states. Enzo, eager to please, made a small adjustment. On his new chart, Zanon's position shifted north by barely 3 nautical miles, placing it firmly within Neapolitan waters instead of the ambiguous no-man's land where it had languished for centuries. A minor tweak, he thought, until the Vatican's own mapmakers noticed. Rome's reaction was swift and furious. The papal navy had long used Zanon as a covert resupply point for ships monitoring Naples. Now, Enzo's map implied those missions had trespassed on foreign soil, an insult wrapped in geography. Pope Sixtus IV dispatched an envoy to Naples, demanding the map's immediate correction and reparations for years of unlawful occupation. King Ferrante, sensing weakness, refused. Instead, he ordered the map printed in bulk and distributed to every major port, a brazen challenge to papal authority. Within weeks, the first skirmish erupted when a Neapolitan warship intercepted a papal galley near the disputed island, its captain waving Enzo's map like a battle standard. What followed was less a war than a cartographer's nightmare come to life. For 8 bloody months, the two powers clashed over a landmass so small, soldiers joked they could march across it in minutes. The irony, Zanon was worthless barren, uninhabited, with no fresh water or strategic value, but by then the fight wasn't about the island, it was about who got to draw the lines. The conflict finally ended when a Venetian diplomat brokered a face-saving compromise. The original map would be retired, and future charts would mark Zanon with a dotted line, acknowledging its ambiguous status. Enzo, now a scapegoat for both sides, fled to Sicily under threat of excommunication. Yet his legacy endured. Rulers across Europe took note of how a single map had forced the Pope to the negotiating table. Soon, royal courts were hiring cartographers not just for their skill with a quill, but for their willingness to wield it like a dagger. The tragedy of Zanon wasn't just the lives lost over a lie. It was the realization that maps could rewrite reality faster than swords could defend it. And in that revelation lay a warning: when trust in parchment outweighs trust in truth, even the smallest dot can drown a kingdom in blood. The Duke of Carinthia's plan was chilling in its simplicity. If you couldn't trust the maps, you couldn't invade. In 1683, facing threats from rival states and internal unrest, he summoned every cartographer in his realm to the palace under the guise of a grand survey. What followed wasn't an update, but an erasure. Over 3 sleepless nights, scribes burned every existing map of the duchy while artists crafted replacements, doctored masterpieces where crumbling fortresses stood tall, where narrow mountain passes widened into plains, and where the kingdom's sparse population clustered into thriving cities. Even the rivers lied, their courses redrawn to suggest natural defenses that didn't exist. The Duke's command was absolute. Henceforth, only these corrected maps would circulate. Dissenters vanished. The past quite literally went up in smoke. For 17 years the deception held. Merchants traveling to Carinthia marveled at how reality seemed to warp as they crossed the border villages described as bustling market towns turned out to be clusters of huts. Impenetrable fortifications were little more than timber palisades. But locals, fearing the Duke's spies, played along. A visiting diplomat's journal from 1691 captures the surreal charade. They speak of phantom mills and granaries as if reciting scripture, pointing to empty fields where the maps promise plenty. The Duke's gambit exploited a fundamental truth. People trust parchment over their own eyes when authority stamps its seal on the lie. The unraveling began with a careless candle. In 1700, a fire tore through the ducal archives, forcing clerks to haul chests of backup documents into the courtyard. Among them was a singed folio of original maps, precise, unaltered records hidden by a defecting cartographer. When scholars compared these to the official versions, the scale of the fraud became undeniable. The Duke had not just tweaked borders, he'd invented an entire prosperous kingdom from ink and imagination. The scandal ripped through Europe's courts. Rival powers, realizing they'd been deterred by fictional defenses, sharpened their swords. Yet the most fascinating fallout wasn't military, it was philosophical. The burned Atlas conspiracy forced a bitter question. If a lie persists long enough, does it become truth? Carinthia's children had grown up memorizing fake geography in school. Its elders had rewritten memories to match the Duke's fiction. Even after exposure, some villages refused to update their maps, clinging to the prettier lie. The Duke himself, facing overthrow, reportedly sneered, "What does it matter? For a generation my kingdom was mighty. That's longer than most truths last." Historians still debate whether the scheme was genius or madness, but its legacy is undeniable. Modern forensic cartographers now analyze old maps for discrepancies the way art experts spot forgeries, checking ink composition, parchment fibers, even the tool marks left by compasses. The Duke's folly taught the world that maps aren't just guides. They're loaded weapons, and sometimes the most dangerous thing they can show you is exactly what someone wants you to see. The most brilliant cartographers didn't just chart land, they wove secrets into the very parchment. Take the case of the enigmatic blue compass map of 1624. Its edges adorned with delicate floral patterns that seemed purely decorative, until a historian in 2012 noticed something odd. The petals weren't random, their numbers matched latitude coordinates. Follow those numbers, and they led to a cave in the Carpathian Mountains where a chest of gold coins, untouched for centuries, still bore the crest of a bankrupt Hungarian prince. This wasn't carelessness, it was a whisper across time, a cartographer's gamble that someone, someday, would be clever enough to read between the lines. Hidden messages thrived in the golden age of mapmaking because parchment was the perfect canvas for deception. Coastlines could hide ciphers in their curves. A bay that jutted just a hair too far west might mark a smuggler's cove. Rivers drawn with exaggerated kinks could spell out letters in Morse code before Morse existed. Even the decorative flourishes, those ornate ships and sea monsters, were often more than they seemed. The famed whale chart of 1689, commissioned by Dutch merchants, depicted a pod of whales off the Azores, but count their spouts, and the sequence pointed to the real treasure, uncharted whaling grounds the merchants wanted to keep for themselves. The most sophisticated codes required insider knowledge to crack. Venetian mapmaker Elena Corvina used a cipher based on her family's lace-making patterns, embedding coordinates in the intricate borders of her portolan charts. Only another artisan would recognize the telltale stitches that marked hidden coves where her brother's ships could evade customs. Likewise, a series of Ottoman naval maps from the 1700s concealed troop movements in the calligraphy of place names. The thickness of a letter's stroke indicating the number of cannons at a fortress, the angle of a diacritical mark revealing the best approach for siege. But why go to such lengths? In an era when maps were both prized and pirated, encryption was survival. A Spanish cartographer imprisoned by the English in 1588 scratched a tiny grid into the margin of his cell's world map, a key to decoding his earlier work, which marked the locations of Spanish silver galleons. He died in captivity, but his cipher lived on, passed among prisoners until it reached sympathetic hands. Two of those ships were recovered in the 1990s, their hulls still stacked with ingots, just where his hidden lines had promised. The thrill isn't just in the treasure, though it's in the mind games. When British naval officer James Rennell created his false Ganges map in 1780 to mislead French rivals, he added an extra layer of mischief. The decoy river branched in a pattern that spelled liar in Latin if you connected the tributaries. A final jab at anyone who trusted his deception too well. Today, as digital scans uncover these hidden narratives, we're left with a humbling truth. Every old map is a palimpsest, its surface geography just the first of many stories waiting to be read. The real challenge isn't seeing what's there, it's imagining what the cartographer dared not write outright. While European powers were busy erasing indigenous lands from their maps, native peoples were quietly rewriting the record, not with ink but with memory and defiance. Take the remarkable case of the Lenape mapmaker who, in 1785, presented colonial officials with what appeared to be a routine land survey. At first glance, it matched the British charts perfectly until someone noticed the subtle additions. Where settlers saw unclaimed wilderness, his delicate strokes revealed ancestral burial mounds. Where their maps marked empty valleys, he'd drawn circular village sites, each labeled with names the Lenape had used for centuries. This wasn't just correction, it was reclamation, proving the land had never been vacant to begin with. Across the continent, similar acts of cartographic resistance unfolded. A Cherokee elder in 1822 secretly annotated a government map with red ochre, marking sacred springs the settlers had dismissed as minor creeks. When missionaries later stumbled upon these sites, they found them still in use ceremonial stones arranged precisely where the elder's map indicated. Meanwhile, in the Great Lakes region, Ojibwe hunters created birchbark maps that overlaid European trade routes with migratory paths used by moose for generations, quietly asserting indigenous knowledge as the true guide through uncharted territory. The boldest countermaps weaponized European conventions against their creators. In 1840, a Nahua artist in Mexico produced a stunning land-grant map for Spanish officials, complete with ornate Catholic iconography, but hid Aztec glyphs in the border motifs. The saints' halos doubled as solar calendars, the decorative vines spelled place names in Nahuatl, and the empty corners teemed with tiny figures planting maize. To colonial eyes, it looked like submission. To his community, it was a defiant ledger of uninterrupted belonging. These maps did more than record geography, they preserved sovereignty. When the U.S. government tried to relocate the Potawatomi in the 1830s, tribal leaders arrived at negotiations with a deerskin map showing trails, council sites, and harvesting grounds that predated American independence. The officials dismissed it as primitive, but the strategy worked. The map's undeniable detail forced concessions, saving key territories from seizure. Similarly, Inuit whalers in the Arctic carved coastal charts into driftwood, encoding tidal patterns and seal migration routes that no European ship could navigate without their guidance. For generations, these maps passed hand to hand but never published, kept outside exploitation at bay. The most poignant countermaps were those never meant to be seen. Cree hunters in Canada scratched temporary charts onto frozen lakes, their lines mirroring constellations only they could read. Navajo weavers threaded topographic memories into blankets, their zigzag patterns tracing mountain passes no settler map recorded. These ephemeral acts whispered a truth colonizers feared most. That land isn't just claimed by parchment and ink, but by footsteps and stories. When a 19th century surveyor bragged he'd mapped every inch of Oregon, a Nez Perce elder corrected him. You drew lines on paper. We carry the land in our bones. Today, these countermaps are finally being recognized as masterpieces of resistance. Modern indigenous communities are digitizing ancestral charts to reclaim legal rights, while artists like the Maori collective Toy Aura project traditional star maps onto government buildings, bathing colonial power structures in older, deeper light. Each one carries forward the same quiet revolution, proving that the truest maps aren't always the loudest, but the ones that outlast every lie. The digital age of deception. Modern technology hasn't ended cartographic lies, it's amplified them. From Google Maps pranks to GPS spoofing, the tradition lives on. Yet today's fabrications are quickly exposed, raising a paradoxical question. In an era of satellites, is it harder or easier to lie about the world? Satellites may watch every inch of the planet, but deception has evolved to match. Consider the case of paper towns, fictional places mapmakers insert to catch copyright violators. In 2015, Google Maps briefly listed a fake town called Argleton in rural England, a digital ghost town that tricked dozens of businesses into listing addresses there. The practice dates back to paper atlases, but now with crowdsourced platforms, these traps can spread globally in hours, and it's not just corporations playing games. In 2019, a Japanese artist moved an entire island by hacking GPS signals, making it appear to drift across the ocean on navigation apps. The stunt lasted weeks before experts noticed. Then there's the darker side of digital deceit. Militaries now weaponize GPS spoofing, feeding enemy drones false coordinates to send them crashing into deserts or oceans. Civilian systems aren't immune. In 2017, ships in the Black Sea found their navigation systems placing them miles inland, the work of Russian spoofers testing their tech. Even athletes aren't safe. Marathon runners have been led astray by manipulated race maps, their tracked routes zigzagging impossibly through buildings or rivers. Yet for all its sophistication, modern cartographic fraud has a fatal flaw: transparency. Medieval mapmakers could bury lies in uncharted territories, but today's fabrications unfold in real time, dissected by millions online. When a prankster renamed the White House Trump-disgraced palace on Google Maps in 2020, the edit survived barely an hour before the crowd corrected it. The same tools that enable deception also empower the masses to police it. The irony: we've never had more accurate maps or more ways to distort them. Apps like Snapchat overlay fantasy landmarks onto real streets, while augmented reality games turn parks into battlegrounds. The line between map and myth blurs daily. Perhaps the real lesson isn't whether lies are harder now, but why we still tell them. After all, a world where every truth is just a click away might be the one where we miss the magic of wondering what's really out there. The human mind isn't built for blank spaces. It craves stories, even when they're written in lies. Cartographic deceptions thrived because they tapped into something deeper than geography: our need for narratives that flatter, frighten, or fascinate us. Consider how easily medieval Europeans embraced maps showing Jerusalem as the world's center, or how eagerly explorers believed in phantom islands like High Brasil. These weren't just mistakes, they were collective fantasies woven into the fabric of culture because they made the world feel ordered, magical, or advantageous. A map that placed your kingdom at the heart of creation wasn't just inaccurate, it was emotionally satisfying. This craving for narrative explains why some lies outlived their creators by centuries. The Zeno map's fictional North Atlantic voyage endured because it fed Renaissance Italy's hunger for a pre-Columbian hero, while the myth of Norumbega persisted because colonists desperately needed to believe the wilderness held ready-made cities. Psychologists call this confirmation bias, our tendency to embrace information that aligns with what we already wish were true. When a 16th century merchant saw a map exaggerating the wealth of a trade partner's city, he didn't question it. The lie validated his ambitions, making the risk of travel feel worthwhile. But the most potent deceptions exploited fear as much as desire. The Vatican's altered pilgrimage maps didn't just inflate holy sites, they weaponized dread, convincing travelers that deviating from church-approved routes meant spiritual peril. Similarly, pirate-forged ghost port charts preyed on a sailor's deepest terror, being lost in a merciless ocean with no sanctuary in sight. Fear and hope are two sides of the same coin, and the best mapmakers knew how to mint both. Modern science reveals just how hardwired this vulnerability is. Brain scans show that when presented with information that aligns with our beliefs, our neural reward centers light up as if we've found treasure. Conversely, facts that challenge our world trigger stress responses, as though truth itself were a threat. No wonder medieval kings clung to maps showing their enemies' lands as barren wastelands, or why lovers paid to have sweethearts' homelands drawn as paradises. The heart doesn't just want what it wants, it remaps reality to justify those desires. Today, we like to think satellites have made us immune to such tricks. But the same psychological forces still shape our digital landscapes. Online, algorithms feed us personalized maps of news and social connections, reinforcing our biases like a medieval cartographer flattering his patron. We dismiss inconvenient truths as fake news and embrace conspiracy theories that cast us as heroes in grand narratives. The tools have changed, but the temptation remains to redraw the world until it tells the story we prefer. The lesson isn't just about old maps gathering dust in libraries. It's about recognizing that every generation has its own cartography of deception, and that the most dangerous lies aren't the ones we're fooled into believing, but the ones we choose to. After all, the first person a map deceives is often the one holding the pen. The ethics of cartography, the legacy of these duels, forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. Who gets to define borders? Can a map ever be truly neutral? As we grapple with AI-generated geography and deepfake terrains, the lessons of medieval liars feel eerily relevant. Perhaps the biggest lie is that maps are objective. They've always been mirrors of our ambitions, fears, and fantasies. Take the simple act of drawing a line. On paper, it's just ink, but in reality, that line might split a village in two, divide families, or erase centuries of shared history. When European powers carved up Africa in the 1800s, they used rulers and compasses to draw borders that ignored rivers, mountains, and tribal lands. The result, arbitrary divisions that still spark conflicts today. The cartographers who drafted those maps weren't just making technical choices, they were making moral ones, whether they realized it or not. Neutrality is another myth. Every mapmaker must decide what to include and what to leave out. A highway map highlights roads but omits hiking trails. A political map shows borders but hides ecosystems. These aren't innocent omissions, they shape how we see the world. In the 1930s, Soviet cartographers deliberately distorted city plans to confuse foreign spies, turning streets into mazes on paper. Was that deceit or self-defense? The answer depends on who you ask. Now, technology has taken the stakes to new heights. AI can generate photorealistic terrain that doesn't exist, while deepfake satellites can fabricate forests or factories with a few keystrokes. During a recent border dispute, one nation accused another of altering digital maps in real time, subtly shifting a river's course to justify troop movements. Sound familiar? It's the same game medieval princes played, only now the lies can go viral before anyone spots the trick. Yet for all their power to deceive, maps also hold the key to justice. Indigenous communities from Canada to Australia are using GIS technology to reclaim ancestral lands, overlaying colonial surveys with oral histories and sacred sites. In Brazil, activists map illegal deforestation in real time, turning satellites into watchdogs. These efforts prove that cartography isn't inherently corrupt, it's a tool, and like any tool, its morality depends on whose hands hold it. The real question isn't whether maps can be neutral, it's whether we can be honest about why we make them. When a child draws their neighborhood with their home at the center, it's not a mistake, it's human nature. The danger comes when we forget that every map, from a pirate's forgery to a smartphone's GPS, carries the fingerprints of someone's agenda. The next time you glance at a map, ask yourself, what story is it telling, and more importantly, whose story is it leaving out? From love-struck forgers to spy cartographers, the history of mapmaking is a tapestry of lies, each thread revealing how deeply geography is entwined with human nature. These deceptions weren't just scribbles on parchment, they were acts of rebellion, desperation, and sometimes breathtaking audacity. Consider the sheer range of motives behind them. A nobleman's heartache etched into river bends, a pirate's trap drawn in phantom ink, or a nun's quiet defiance stitched into the borders of her convent's land. Maps became weapons because they shaped reality itself, not just for kings and generals, but for lovers, outcasts, and dreamers who refused to accept the world as it was handed to them. The true power of these lies wasn't in their artistry, but in their endurance. A well-crafted forgery could outlive its creator by centuries, weaving itself into history books, treaties, and even the collective imagination. The Xenomap's fictional Atlantic voyage lingered in textbooks long after its exposure, while Norumbeg's golden towers haunted explorers' journals like a mirage that refused to fade. These weren't mere mistakes, they were stories so compelling, so flattering to the cultures that embraced them, that truth became secondary. The human mind clings to narratives that affirm its desires, whether it's the medieval church's vision of a Jerusalem-centered world or a colonial power's fantasy of empty lands ripe for taking. Yet these deceptions also reveal something hopeful, the unstoppable creativity of the human spirit. For every map that erased indigenous villages or fabricated borders, there was a countermap, a birchbark sketch, a smuggled correction, a whispered truth passed hand to hand. The Lenape elder who redrew burial mounds onto colonial surveys, the Cherokee hunter who annotated creeks with sacred names, these acts were more than defiance. They were proof that no lie, no matter how boldly stamped with authority, could fully extinguish the stories of those who knew the land deeper than ink could reach. Today, the battleground has shifted, but the stakes remain just as high. Algorithmic maps curate our digital worlds, hiding inconvenient truths behind personalized feeds. GPS spoofing turns navigation into a hall of mirrors, while deepfake satellites render geography as malleable as medieval vellum. The tools have changed, but the game hasn't. Whoever controls the map controls the narrative. That's why the lessons of history matter now more than ever. In a world drowning in misinformation, the sharpest tool we have isn't just skepticism, it's curiosity. The willingness to ask, as that Nez Perce elder did, whose bones carry the land and whose stories are being left off the page. So the next time you open an app or unfold a paper map, pause for a moment. Look for the seams, the quiet omissions, the places where the ink smudges just a little too conveniently. Because every map, old or new, is a conversation between power and resistance, truth and desire, the world as it is and the world as someone wants you to see it. The greatest cartographic duel isn't behind us. It's the one we're all living through, every time we choose which version of the world to believe. If this journey through the shadows of cartography has sparked your curiosity, let's keep the conversation going. Hit like, subscribe, and dive into the comments what's the most surprising map deception you've ever encountered. Until next time, remember, the most dangerous lies aren't the ones we doubt, but the ones we never think to question. Keep exploring, keep wondering, and above all, keep drawing your own maps.